Airing on Asheville FM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. On this episode, Ian spoke with Adam Shapiro, co-editor of We Are Many, a comics anthology released as part of the Cypher zine project, which can be found at Cypher_comics on Instagram, and published by Radix Media. The book pairs artists and activists to create narratives around the defense of women and sex workers around the globe. Among other topics, the conversation touches on the process of matching local artists with the activists on the ground, notions of human rights defense as defined by UN guidelines as it relates to autonomous, self-directed struggle. They also speak about the strengths and limitations of NGO-led initiatives and the effects of emergent disasters on long-term organizing initiatives. More information on that publishing project can be found at cypherzine.org. But first, some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
It's almost the end of the year. Tomorrow's Christmas. And that means it's time for the first annual Swainiac Burning Book Review. So we'll put a log on the fire, and you can all put on your pajamas and gather around in a circle, and we'll pretend like I know what I'm talking about, as I tell you about 10 of the books I've read this year. Some of them are good, some of them bad. So let's get started. Full disclosure, I'm not much of a poetry guy. I got a writing scholarship once, and my professor told me to focus on my prose. I asked him about my poetry, and he said, exact words, "Your poetry is shit." And he's right. But I read 2 collections this year. One is Fables and Spells by Adrienne Marie Brown, which is poetry and short fiction, and the other is Doppelgangbanger by Courtney Lamar Charleston. I imagine everyone knows Adrienne Marie Brown. To say Fables and Spells is okay, it's kind of like saying Taylor Swift's last album was all right. You're going to get chased by a mob with pitchforks and torches. But all the same, I can't help thinking that when I read Brown, that I'm consuming the stuff that privileged white suburbanites read when they want to feel radical. Which isn't bad. I love to see someone black and non-binary from Detroit take money from suburbia. But what feels missing from Fables and Spells? I found in Doppelgangbanger by Courtney Lamar Charleston, a challenging collection that still reveals a great deal of vulnerability. The work revolves around Charleston's being black and gender non-conforming in the suburbs of Chicago. It's pretty awesome stuff. And so now we get to several histories. The first is John Davies' A History of Whales. Whales, as in the country, not the aquatic species. He traces the history from the first archaeological evidence to the present, the period before the English colonization makes me want to put on a kilt and tip over a cop car. Well, a cop wagon. Mark Bray's latest is also awesome. The Anarchist Inquisition, Assassins, Activists, and Martyrs in Spain and France. It focuses on a period at the end of the 19th century when anarchists were off the hook. Spoiler alert, bombs are going off on every page, and a head of state gets shanked in his carriage right there in the street. No shit. Another awesome book focused on this same period is Means and Ends, The Revolutionary Practice of Anarchism in Europe and the United States, by Zoe Baker. This page-turner, like Bray's, makes those dead anarchists more relevant than ever. These 2 books could be a college course curriculum in anarchism. Which takes us to Rattling the Cages, Oral Histories of North American Political Prisoners, compiled by Josh Davidson with Eric King, who just got released. I'm not just promoting this because I contributed, but because the book presents so many voices that need to be heard. Ed Mead, one of the contributors, died recently. Ed was part of the George Jackson Brigade, who blew up the headquarters of the Washington State prison system, and his life was like an action movie. He wrote in Rattling the Cages, "So here's the thing, from our perspective. You fight the class enemy from wherever you find yourself on their soil. So it's not time out when you go to prison. You continue your political work in whatever form that might take. I think Ed Mead was a role model for all of us. An excellent biography makes my book review this year, Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life by John Lee Anderson. While most bios of the Argentine guerrilla reduce him to a face on a t-shirt, Anderson presents the icon in the fullness of his humanity, which makes him far more relatable. Even though, at the end of the Cuban Revolution, he presided over executions of anarchists, there is still plenty here that's inspiring and relevant today. And so we arrive at Murray Bookchin. There are 2 books by and about Bookchin that I read this year. Remaking Society, A New Ecological Politics by Murray Bookchin, and Recovering Bookchin, Social Ecology and the Crises of Our Time by Andy Price. For the longest time, I've wanted to like Bookchin. I really have. The problem for me has been that I just don't know what the fuck he's saying. His language is seemingly deliberately inaccessible and more than a little bit vague. I don't know if I'm reading a treatise on the social revolution or a Portuguese translation of smelt fishermen discussing the influence of Darwin on modern culture. But with these 2 books, I finally deciphered what Bookchin is saying. And I don't like him. He's useless unless you're someplace like Rojava, where there's a power vacuum and a galvanized population seeking a collective way forward. But I've seen nothing useful to apply for folks who are still existing within the confines of empire or its colonies. You gotta open up a free space before Bookchin makes sense. And so these are great theories post-struggle, not pre-struggle. And I can't think of anything more useless than post-struggle theories. If you're looking for an excuse to avoid the inevitable political violence that revolutions require, Bookchin is great for that kind of wheel spinning. The last book in this year's Swainiac Burning Book Review is A Profession Without Reason, The Crisis of Contemporary Psychiatry Untangled and Solved by Spinoza, Freethinking, and Radical Enlightenment by Bruce E. Levine. If you can get past the longest subtitle in the history of ever, and if you can get past the frequent departures into contemplations about what Spinoza might have said about a science that developed long after Spinoza sputtered out, Levine presents a well-researched and structured critique of psychiatry and the social sciences, one that we all need to read in a world where systems of social control frame our happiness and madness into the rubric of mental health. It's a must-read for anyone seeking to question power that's rarely ever questioned. And so, that brings us to the end of this year's Swainiac Burning Book Review. In closing, remember, hierarchy is a swindle, obedience is boring, and if political violence is not the right answer, you're probably asking the wrong questions. Happy holidays. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org.
My name is Adam Shapiro, he, him, and let's see, I'm the co-founder and co-publisher of Cypher Comics, which is the entity that produced the book We Are Many, defending women and sex worker rights defenders.
Can you talk a little bit about the origins and the goals of Cypher Comics and maybe how it relates to the wider picture of frontline defenders?
Sure. So we started Cypher Comics after a few months after the pandemic began in 2020, when in my role at the time as the head of visibility and communications for Frontline Defenders, the Irish human rights organization working to defend human rights defenders around the world, we were looking for ways to keep up the visibility work, giving a platform for human rights defenders and their stories to tell at a time when the world was sort of shutting down. And at a time when it wasn't really possible to travel, to use, I used to travel and do video documentation and other types of narrative storytelling, and wanted to come up with a way at that time to continue to be able to bring forward stories and get them out there and disseminate them with those challenges in place. And so I had previously done a book called La Lucha back in 2015 about women human rights defenders in Mexico. It was a graphic novel book that told the stories of a number of women human rights defenders, and we were quite successful with it, both in the United States and in Mexico. And so I thought, let's try using comics again, and working with different artists from around the world and create a zine, a digital zine that could be the platform for these stories. And so together with Beldan Sazen, who is an artist and collaborator I've worked with before on other projects, we discussed the idea and brought it to fruition after just about 6 or 8 weeks of both discussion and then planning the first edition. And then I think it was in July 2020 that we brought the first Cypher zine to digital print. And from there, it became a monthly project, bringing forward anywhere between usually 3 and 5 stories a month. And during the pandemic period, it was a bit easier to do because my own work was severely restricted because of the pandemic in terms of what I was able to do compared to normal times. So I was able to dedicate a lot more time to Cypher. And yeah, it's continued for almost 2 years before I finally stepped away from Frontline Defenders. But when I did, I was able to negotiate to be able to take the project with me, Cypher, with me out of the organization. And we're now an independent entity, and we'll be restarting the zine in the winter of 2024.
Can you maybe draw some parallels or maybe compare and contrast your experience working with, graphic storytelling as compared to documentary storytelling?
Sure. I think there's a couple of things. So for one, working with artists to depict another person's story, and in the way we worked was to pair an artist with a human rights activist or a community of activists, and have the artist work with those protagonists to develop the story, to develop the script, to develop like the look and the feel of the artwork itself, and then to bring that to us. We gave the artists like a huge amounts of creative license to work with the defenders to bring those stories forward. And oftentimes our role between Beldan and myself was just simply to offer editing suggestions when it came to language more than anything else. Oftentimes, especially because in a lot of places the folks we worked with were not native English speakers, so we were working in translation a lot of times, things like that. So that kind of process where you're bringing together somebody who's coming at it from a visual storytelling perspective and someone who is the subject of the documentation itself, bringing them together to collaborate, I think creates a different dynamic and a different kind of control over the story than even when I, as a documentary filmmaker, my perspective on that is to really, I'm asking questions of the subject, of the person that I'm interviewing, and obviously I'm coming at it with a perspective with those questions that I'm asking. When we get to the editing stage of video, I'm making decisions usually, to a large extent on my own as the editor and director of these projects. I'm sharing them in a collaborative way with who I've interviewed, but largely a lot of the editorial decisions are made at the time are made by myself and then brought forward for review. Whereas in the comics, as the kind of style that we work with is to allow that collaboration throughout the entire process between the artist, the creator of the visual storytelling, and the subject of that storytelling. And so I think there's a different kind of engagement there, a different kind of control that the activist has over how their story is depicted. And we've had, phenomenal, engagements between the activists and the artists on all of the comics that we've done. And then finally, I would say the difference also is with audience. I mean, for a long time, I think documentary films have been seen in the human rights community as a way to sort of get the word out there, to get messaging out there, to get, lessons or important points from the human rights space told to a wider audience. But I think the reality is that for the most part, human rights documentaries tend to be seen mainly by the human rights community, with some exceptions that tend to end up then getting more into the mainstream. But largely, its audience is being found in communities that are already supportive, are already to some extent clued in, and it's not really engaging new or different audiences. What we found with comics and graphic storytelling is that there's an entire world of an audience out there that is interested in this format, that is interested in this way of storytelling, and are open to receiving this kind of communications, this kind of storytelling about human subjects that have to do with human rights or other types of struggles or liberation or other kinds of storytelling that maybe isn't, that is just one among many types of stories that can be told through this medium. And because of that, I feel like we are able to reach actually a different and wider audience with this format than we would through video. It's also, I think, more accessible in a lot of ways too, because there's obviously still a technology issue, but with the graphic storytelling, you don't need to be literate to receive it and to understand the messaging and to understand the stories. And while you don't necessarily have to read in a documentary film, the accessibility of documentary films, I think, is more limited than what we're able to do with the comics or the graphic storytelling. So for me, even though I come from a documentary film background and I have zero talent whatsoever when it comes to any kind of artistic production on paper, I find it can be a much more effective means of communicating.
Can you talk a little bit more in depth about the process of pairing the activists with the artists? I'm interested in knowing, what kind of factors inform the pairings, and I'm interested in knowing how close the results were with what you had, envisioned.
So I think the approach that we've taken with this so far has largely been for once we know that we have an activist who's interested in using this format and as for storytelling purposes, Beldan and I will then do research. And our first sort of step is to try to find an artist who's from the same country as the activist, both because of sort of very technical issues like language, overcoming language barriers, understanding the cultural context, etc., time zones, but also because we feel like it's really important there, if possible, to be face-to-face communication, even though, again, we started this during the pandemic, so that even was a challenge, but where the artist can access if not the individual, but at least be able to understand and know the context in which their struggles are happening on that local level. So that's kind of our first cut, in the sense, was to say, okay, if we have activists from Sierra Leone or from Egypt or from Chile or wherever, let's try to find somebody from that country, if possible. If it wasn't possible to find somebody from that country, or if finding an artist in that country, if it happened to be a country where repression and freedom of expression was, where repression was rampant and freedom of expression wasn't available at levels that were deemed safe, we understood to be safe enough for an artist to produce, then we might try to find somebody from outside the country to work with, but still somebody from a similar cultural, linguistic, and who understood this sort of political context in which that person was operating. And then after that, it really depended on what kind of, if we were working with somebody from an environmental background, we would try to research and find artists who had worked in that milieu before, people who were familiar with environmental concerns or maybe had drawn or done some work in that sector before, so that they were even more familiar with the context in which the human rights activist was operating. This is, including and paying attention to identity issues, as well. So if we were working with an indigenous activist or community, we would try to find indigenous activists from that same country or general geographic region. So those were some of the conditions that we had. And then after we would do the research and try to identify a few options, Beldan and I would share what we found with the activists, because oftentimes, there would be different styles that people, worked in, and ask the activists, like what they preferred, where their preferences might be, what kind of things they were interested in visually from seeing the artist's work. And then usually we would be able to narrow it down to probably two options to go to, and then reach out to the artists. We often try to find artists who don't necessarily have a lot of exposure, in part because we like to see this as an opportunity to give up-and-coming artists an opportunity to have greater exposure with their work, and including to an international audience. So that wasn't necessarily a criteria, but it was definitely something that we were intent on trying to use this platform to give greater opportunities.
So I'm used to talking with people who are sort of organizing in autonomous spaces towards autonomous ends. With that regard, my understanding is that your experience lies in the NGO space. Is that correct?
For this project, yeah, it came out of the NGO space, but myself personally, I've been a grassroots activist. I was one of the people who started the International Solidarity Movement in Palestine, and doing a lot of on-the-ground activism, working with local communities, in liberation struggles and whatnot.
And in identifying these activists who participate, is this kind of coming from a confluence of both of those backgrounds? Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. At least as far as frontline defenders goes, who we consider to be human rights defenders, it didn't matter if they were part of an NGO or not, as long as they were undertaking some sort of activity, work, speaking out, writing, whatever, standing on the front lines to defend the rights of their communities, of other people, etc. It didn't matter what structure they belonged to, or whether they were independent, autonomous, part of a community, etc. So we worked with folks from a variety of backgrounds.
In putting this together, did you approach the project with a specific audience in mind? In the introduction, you talk a little bit about the kind of landmark comic book philosophy book, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. McCloud said every act committed to paper by the comics artist is aided and abetted by a silent accomplice, an equal partner in crime known as the reader. So in assembling We Are Many, did you take any cues from previous works or approaches? And what are you asking of this silent accomplice, the reader?
So with not just the book, but the entire project of Cypher, we were very keen, again, having come out of sort of this idea of like, we have this sort of privileged ability to access and engage with people who are on the forefronts of struggles all over the world for basic rights, for various types of liberation, for protecting the environment, protecting their communities, and stories that are often not well known outside of their immediate communities. And the idea or the premise of this was to try to create a bigger platform for those stories to be seen, heard, understood, and incorporated into, at various levels. So whether it was using the comics as part of a larger advocacy plan around that the activists themselves were developing, or that as an international organization from Frontline Defenders perspective, where we were supporting those advocacy efforts. So using it at that level, using a level of just trying to engage through dissemination of the comics, through the artwork, through social media and other like shared spaces within the activists' own community, like larger community in their country or in their region, to give them a bigger platform, not only to talk about the work that they're doing and the importance of the rights that they're defending, but also in some ways as a effort to sort of help develop security. The idea that the more an activist is known about and their work is known, the harder it is for authorities to crack down on that person, because then there would be a greater community outcry. So there was kind of a protection element to this as well. So these are the kind of things that we imagined and thought about when it came to the purposes for how these stories could be used, how they could be deployed, and what we were hoping for from the reader, from the different kinds of audiences that we were trying to engage. Some of it was about developing empathy. Some of it was about developing greater awareness. Some of it was about trying to compel action from those, in the audience who are stakeholders who might be able to take action to support, whether it was for, again, policy related things or potentially even funding type thing, purposes, exposing activists to a philanthropic community, for instance. So there was a variety of purposes, and depending on which audience, we were thinking about, what we were hoping for and intending for there to to be an impact from in terms of where they sit in the sort of the ecosystem of audience. And for that, I would say one of the biggest things that sort of influenced how we thought about the project was from the experience that we had with Beldan. I worked with her before we started Cypher. We went off at the request of human rights activists in Manipur, India, which is an area of India that is under military occupation, and where access to the territory is quite restricted. We were able to get in and go and document. Beldan was the artist in this case, because we weren't able to identify a local artist to work with who felt it was safe enough to draw and to do this and publish their work. So Beldan is an artist. She did her research, and of course we were there and meeting people and talking to people and going through the whole entire process with her there. And through that process of engagement, through that process of publishing, and we published with a local Indian magazine, reaching a very wide audience throughout the entire country, we were able to sort of understand how the storytelling, this graphic storytelling, could be used for different spaces and different purposes and reaching different audiences with different expectations in mind. One of the activists who we featured in that has since used the storytelling that we did to help elevate the profile of his organization, which worked for LGBT rights, LGBTQ plus rights, actually. In Manipur, it was an issue that didn't receive a lot of attention at all locally. It was sort of on the margins, but he was able to use the comic and the publication of it to help enhance his organization's standing in the community, and then also nationally and internationally, in order to be able to get greater attention and support from philanthropic organizations, etc. Others used the comic, the story that we produced, to just raise awareness about this territory and the fact that it was, under a military occupation and where people didn't have fundamental rights equal to other Indian citizens, and used it on a national level to raise awareness. So those kinds of things, I think, very much that experience very much influenced how we thought about Cypher and how we thought about the kind of impact it could have, including with the book, We Are Many.
I noticed a prominent palette within the book. The pink and the purple figure prominently. And I also noticed that the umbrellas figure prominently. So can you talk about what the umbrellas represent in the context of sex worker defense and
Sure.
the significance of the palette? And I guess maybe the importance of tapping into existing symbolism in this kind of work, what the significance of that is, and what the aims are.
So the red umbrella, as you point out, is very much a symbol, marker for sex workers, and this has become sort of a globalized symbol. And I don't know sufficiently enough about the history of that symbol, but I do know that enough to know that this has become something that I think is ubiquitous within the sex worker rights movement, in order to both mark to each other. The umbrella is meant to offer some form of protection, but also gathering in of the people in this movement. And I think for the sex worker rights community that we've engaged, both with with other work that we've done, but also with the storytelling, having that symbol in there is a kind of it serves to both recognize and offer a sense of community, a sense of that this is a safe space, that this is a story or a depiction that resonates to the community, because we understand, and the artists and the protagonists, who insisted on the symbology being there, understand the significance of the symbol and the marking that it has, and what it signifies to the community. And so as editors, we didn't insist on it. We didn't, suggest it in any way. This is what came out naturally from that process between the artists and the activists. And I think having it there, having it in these stories, again, it signifies to within the community that this is part of that community, that comes from that community, and that the people who are depicted in the stories and the artists who are working in allyship with those activists very much understand and respect and appreciate that community of rights defenders. I think for the larger issue about, in some of our other stories, which will come out in some of the other anthologies, there's other symbolism that speaks to specific contexts. So we have a couple of stories about Palestine, for instance, where some of the symbology that's associated with the Palestinian movement does appear in those stories because it naturally comes out of those stories. With Hong Kong, we had the story from Hong Kong and about efforts there to stand up to increasing authoritarianism. Some of the symbology that's used in the story speaks very powerfully to the community in Hong Kong and the democracy movement in both Hong Kong and China. That may not be as familiar to people who aren't familiar with that context, but it still was important to the protagonists and to the artists to make sure that symbology was there, so that it did speak to that community itself, first and foremost. With the pink and purple, I think it just so happens that because we made this first collection of stories about women's rights defenders and sex worker rights defenders, that just happened to be the kind of dominance of color that palette that was used by the artists. It wasn't necessarily intentional for these stories came out again over the period of a couple of years and with many different artists. So I think it just ended up being that way. It wasn't something we noticed as we were doing the stories, because in one of the editions of Cypher, from whatever month, there might be one story about a women's rights defender, one story about, an indigenous community, and one story about like the political struggle in Sudan or something like that. So I think it's more accidental, but it worked out.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
The border is not just a wall. It's not just a line on a map. It's a power structure, a system of control. The border does not divide one world from another. There is only one world, and the border is tearing it apart.
The Ex-Worker Podcast presents No Wall They Can Build, a guide to borders and migration across North America. A serialized audiobook in 11 chapters released every Wednesday. Tune in at crimethink.com/podcast.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support.
It's very interesting how those things tend to sync up, though, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the term human rights defender? I wonder, am I correct that the qualities of a human rights defender look different in every country and are shaped by the context of their surroundings? And, I would like to know what the universal qualities are, and I would like to know how that term would relate to the term of an organizer or an activist, say.
Mm-hmm. So I think you're right. It does look different in every country, and every, sometimes even within countries, it can look quite different depending on circumstances and where you are. There is a universal sort of, there is a United Nations resolution that was adopted by the General Assembly in 1998 for recognition and protection of human rights defenders. And in that resolution, which has become kind of like the founding document and sort of helps define who would be a human rights defender. Basically, the resolution allows for anybody at any time to be considered a human rights defender if they're undertaking an effort, work, or a stand of some kind to defend the rights of others or their communities along the defending one of the rights that are covered under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's a profession. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's something you're doing all the time. And so, in the sort of most liberal or open interpretation of that, if someone is writing an article in defense of the human rights, one of the many human rights that people are meant to enjoy, for the the person writing that article, they could be otherwise, let's say, a finance reporter. But let's say that person feels compelled to write about something, that is of interest to them. In that moment that they're writing that, publishing that, they could be a human rights defender. It often comes up with a question of this identity often comes up when someone, though, is being persecuted for that activity. So being punished in some way, intimidated, harassed, or worse, in the worst case scenario, killed for their work as a human, for their efforts as a human rights defender. Over time, that initial definition has come to also include defense of the environment. So even though defending the land or defending, those who are working to stop the community of activists who are working on climate change, for instance, most organizations, most folks in the UN system, et cetera, and these like formal structures do today count and consider those who are working in those sectors, in those spaces, as human rights defenders, even though they aren't defending, let's say, an individual right or even a community right, although the community right to clean air, clean water, et cetera, is something that has increasingly become a norm. For my work in Frontline Defenders, I think we used, the organization I used to work for and where this project started, we did try to apply, a very, very wide interpretation of who would be a human rights defender, particularly if somebody was being attacked for doing that kind of activity. The interesting thing and why this book, why it was so important for us to include sex worker rights defenders in this book is because we do believe, we do see both Beldan and I, and also at Frontline Defenders at the time, and still consider those who are defending the rights of sex workers to do this work as a profession, to do sex work as a profession, or not even as a profession, but just as an activity that they're doing for whatever purposes, for however long they're doing it, that the people who are protecting those individuals' rights are also human rights defenders. And that obviously, for lots of reasons, or at least lots of excuses, is considered to be somewhat controversial. And in some cases taboo. There are some organizations out there in the ecosystem of human rights organizations that don't consider sex worker rights defenders as human rights defenders. But we took, at least at Frontline Defenders, we took an approach that looked at it from, are these people defending the rights of, related to labor rights or health rights or, gender-based rights or any other kinds of identity rights. We took that as in the affirmative and therefore, included that. And for this book, we felt it was really important to also include those stories. In terms of, the attempts to, use the term human rights defender as opposed to activist or as opposed to organizer, essentially, basically, they're synonymous, I would say, for the most part, in almost every instance that I can think of. But the term human rights defender has developed because of the UN resolution and because of other institutionalized spaces where things like, the European Union has guidelines on the protection of human rights defenders. So this term human rights defender has become sort of like the institutional term that's meant to both signal and to which states and other stakeholders make commitments. But in practical terms, I always thought of myself as an activist. I never actually used to think of myself with this term human rights defender. Although I think it certainly applies. I don't think, there's no denigration in that sense towards the word activist or organizer or anything like that. It's more just that this has become a kind of institutionalized norm, terminology for the norm, which is meant for the protection of all these people who are doing this work.
To tie it in with, I guess, the wider project of Cypher, in the introduction of the book, you talk about the different meanings of the word Cypher. You touch on Cypher as a secret code, and you also touch on the sort of the hip-hop connotation of Cypher as a form of collaboration.
Mhm.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you have observed in the collaboration between these human rights defenders and the folks who they are defending. Um,
Mhm.
the groups who they seek to defend and represent.
Mhm. So I think what I've observed, and this is beyond just the storytelling process that we have with Cypher, but having spent the better part of 10 years working for an organization that was working for the protection of human rights defenders, I obviously got to observe. I got to visit. I must have traveled to over 60 countries during that time, and so I got to see a lot of people working on the front lines of struggle in a lot of different contexts, different places, different geographies, etc. And one thing I would think is pretty consistent across the board, depending, no matter where you are, is that those who are putting themselves out there for the defense of another group of people or of their community or of their environment or their land or whatever are often doing so understanding first and foremost that they're putting themselves at risk and often also putting themselves their families at risk of some kind. It could be physical risk, physical harm. It could be risk of reputational harm. It could be risk of just simply there being limitations to the kinds of opportunities that they or their family members might have later on in other walks of life, unrelated to their activism. And in doing so, I think the for the most, pretty much, every case that I've observed and worked with people who are undertaking this work, they're often doing it out of a position of love. And I know it sounds a little bit corny, and I would be the last person that folks would expect to say it this way, but I do believe it's true. I do believe that people are operating from a position of love for their community, for the people that they find community with. And it doesn't have to be the people that they're living in the same community with. It could be, based on identity, issues, or simply out of respect, or a sense of fairness, a sense of empathy. And that, I think, is something that is really extraordinary, because it's easy to be cynical about a lot of stuff that we see in our world. And it's easy even sometimes to be cynical about human rights activists also. None of these people who are undertaking this work are perfect human beings. We all make mistakes. We all, interpret things our own ways. And sometimes that isn't the same in sync with people around us all the time. But I think nonetheless, in the work that I've seen human rights defenders undertake and the way they undertake it, it always comes down to this sense of real love and, I would say, solidarity. These two principles that I think guide the work of human rights defenders and how they engage with their communities. And from the community standpoint, it's a hard thing sometimes to see people who are putting themselves out there to defend your rights if you're not necessarily comfortable with doing that yourself. And it can be a tricky kind of dynamic and a tricky kind of relationship. And especially the more that dependency a dependency type of relationship that can develop between a community and its, or the organizers in the community or the activists in the community, that can develop too. And that sometimes there can be unhealthy elements to that as well. But that said, I think, I've always seen a tremendous amount of respect from communities for those people who are undertaking to put themselves out there, even and especially when there is, great personal risk for doing so. And when somebody from the community, who's a human rights defender, who, to whom harm is done, when that happens, it can be very devastating for the community itself. And people often, only begin to start really appreciating those organizers amongst them once something, bad, unfortunately, happened. There is that element of it. And it, it's, I'm just thinking about some of the indigenous communities I met, for instance, in South America, or trans community in Aceh, Indonesia, or, different types of places where I've been, where we're talking about working with or communities that are very much on the margins of society, and very much at risk because of their identity or because of where they live or because of the mineral resources that are under them that companies and governments want. These are, they're high stakes for a lot of these groups. And yet, I think the principles of love and solidarity really do shine through.
So I guess in that regard, I'm trying to think of the best way to ask this. So these stories all place the activists in the foreground of the story. And I get that has sort of a narrative place because you kind of have to start the story somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I'm asking is in what ways does this, I guess, activist-led approach empower the people who they are ostensibly defending and educating? I guess I want to know if you think something is lost by not placing the people struggling against the oppression in the foreground. And I guess it's sort of, you answered this previously, it's sort of a function of the environment that they're in. But I would like to know when advocacy is a better strategy than self-directed organizing.
So I'll preface this by saying that some of the stories, a fair number that we do have in the collection, and again, this is the first collection of this first anthology, a volume of an anthology. We have 2 others that will be coming out over the next couple of years. Some of them do approach it more of from a collective perspective or the community and the struggle perspective. That said, this was a project started at an organization, as you pointed out, Frontline Defenders, which took an approach of its entire mission as an NGO was to protect human rights defenders. And that's ultimately one of the reasons why I finally left after 10 years, is because I actually wanted it to be working more on the struggle side of it, on the larger collective side of it, rather than the focus on the activists or the defenders, and limit it to that. I wanted to work more on causes and struggles more broadly. And so with Cypher, up until we went independent, that was kind of like the mandate that we had with this project, because it was under the auspices of this organization. Now that we're independent, we do plan on doing a wider range of storytelling. I think we'll still have profiles of activists, stories that are driven by the protagonists in that case. But I think we plan on having also more stories that depict the broader struggle of a community, and not that kind of like primary focus on the individuals, because that fits more both with my own sort of both mine and Beldam, both of us, our own approaches to how we see solidarity, how we see using this platform, and what Cypher can be, and where we want to go with the project. So I would just say, in a year and 2 years, I think you'll see a greater diversity of these kinds of stories, and I think we'll all be better for it. I will say that, unfortunately, over one of the sort of maybe unintended consequences, but nonetheless somewhat of a reality of the UN resolution on human rights defenders and the increased focus on safety and protection for human rights defenders, which over the last 20 years has become a real critical issue, as the number of defenders killed each year increases, the number of defenders incarcerated each year because of their human rights work increases globally. The emphasis by funders, by governments, by international organizations, etc., the greater emphasis on protection of the activists or of the defenders, I believe, has led to a decrease in attention and funding and space, opportunities to be engaged, not to be engaged, but for support, for there to be support and spaces for the struggles themselves, the bigger issues themselves to be addressed. And I do believe that, I think that it doesn't have to be an either or, but unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you see the way resources are deployed, or you see the way spaces are offered, or what gets privileged in terms of how things are reported in the media or whatever. ends up tending to minimize the bigger collective struggle at the expense of giving higher profile or support to the individual activists, in part from a protection standpoint and in part from a, to some extent from a storytelling standpoint. And that's definitely something that we're intending to shift away from with Cypher as we go forward with it. And so I think you'll see a lot more of that coming out. And I think it's in part because we recognize and understand that, the bigger struggle, as the defenders themselves often articulate, is the important thing. And that's where the attention needs to be.
This might then tie into what you just explained. Do you think that the concept of human rights defense is separate from political action? I felt that the language of We Are Many, the way in which these stories were told, they sort of felt politically neutral, even though you could certainly feel the solidarity through them. And I wonder if that is sort of a function of the Human Rights Defense Project, and maybe also to make this kind of work more palatable to a wider audience.
I do think that the global human rights movement, if we think of it from the international perspective, in terms of like the big organizations, the big international organizations, and the spaces that they create for activists from around the world to participate in, does try to de-emphasize the politics of human rights and of the movements, of the struggles. And I think that that's been a growing trend over the last 20 years or so to do that. I think at the local levels, though, activists very much understand what their struggles are and how they are political and politicized and how they are engaging in politics. Now, there's definitely been those who, even at local levels, try to de-emphasize the political element of their struggles, because they understand from the repression that they face that once they enter into a space that's considered political, it puts them and their movements and everything at much graver risk. And if they try to keep it or try to express it in a way that tries to convey a political neutrality, it's a strategic approach to try to believe that they can achieve something or move the center of gravity or move stakeholders, political elites, whatever, and shift them if they're able to take in some countries LGBT plus rights, de-emphasizing the political element of it in order to try to achieve positive results has been a strategy that folks have tried. Whether or not it's successful can be assessed, on a case-by-case basis. But there has been this kind of idea that and I'm not picking on this community at all. It's just this is the one that came to mind immediately. But there are others in environmental spaces and labor rights spaces and other spaces where the effort to de-emphasize politics, or that is the movement as political, in order to appeal to a more universal, an idea of a universal human rights perspective that is politically neutral, is sometimes a strategic choice by local activists, and something that gets a lot of support by the international community, by donors, by others who want to be contributing to something that they see as above politics. That probably is, I think, not a great way of approaching it, and I think that to understand human rights struggles as not political is a disservice, and a complete misunderstanding. I mean, I don't think that those who are doing the repression ever stop thinking that human rights is political. And so you're sort of operating in a way that is not engaging the entity that you're up against on the same terms that they understand it. And not that they can necessarily dictate the terms to you, but you have to be able to come up with I've spent a lot of time working on and being involved with like nonviolent strategic resistance approaches and tactics and theories and strategies. And it's one of the key things is to understand, when you're trying to undo the pillars of support for that repression, you have to understand how those pillars of support operate in order to undo them. And if you're ceding political ground to appeal to a more universal idea that your opponent or the person you're confronting or entity that you're confronting doesn't at all consider, it's very hard to see how you can remove that pillar of support without engaging it more directly and more probably more accurately.
So for my last question, none of these struggles occur in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about how emergent humanitarian crises can impact work that's already going on, like how you have observed it, kind of superseding or shifting the center of gravity or anything along those lines? Does that question make sense?
I think so. I think it depends a little bit on the kind of humanitarian crisis that we're talking about. If it's in the realm of natural disaster, then I think what happens is that human rights defenders, civil society, who are connected to civil society or just to, at grassroots levels with communities, oftentimes can be the most effective first responders and really at the forefront of bringing immediate humanitarian assistance, pointing out where humanitarian assistance needs to get to, and also exposing in a lot of cases. And I'm reminded here of like the disaster in Hawaii not that long ago, where you had, activists on the ground who were not only directing where humanitarian support needed to go, but also exposing the politics and the disaster that was, I think the way they saw it is kind of like it was an inevitable disaster because of the way that the land had been allocated and changed, and the disrespect completely for indigenous rights and indigenous ways of living. And I think that became part of the discussion in a way that was wholly due to the activism that was going on in Hawaii at the time. I think if we're talking about, though, something more overt, in terms of being man-made, like what's happening in Gaza right now, activists are targeted as part of this process that Israel is undertaking in Gaza, whether they're journalists, whether professional journalists or grassroots journalists, human rights organizations and activists have been targeted. Their offices have been destroyed. Their homes have been destroyed, and others have been killed. This is part and parcel of the intentionality of what I would see as genocidal policy going on to end the Palestinian people in Gaza. So I think it depends a little bit on the kind of humanitarian crisis that we're talking about, but I've certainly seen across everywhere I've been, where I've been in places where there are these crises, where human rights defenders, activists, organizers are often the ones best equipped, best placed to be the ones to direct emergency response, first response, and then even like thinking through the longer term implications and how to either rebuild or overcome. And a lot of times getting those voices heard, especially when you have like an international system of crisis humanitarian response that comes in, getting those voices heard and prioritized is itself a struggle also, and competing for oxygen in those spaces where discussions are had, plans are made, strategies are set, and budgets are allocated. That is a very much, and while I think there's been some change over the years to respect that, that's also a very fraught political space, and human rights activists trying to maintain their work and at the same time respond to crises face, a double burden of on top of the repression that they face.
And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I think that's probably a good place to put a pin in it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the time.
This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm Books is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.